Hello! So, the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. And probably this will be coming out after I've done the live on the subject, so, you know, I've already made a start then. And yes, I'm trying to get it to auto shrink up to that position, but haven't quite got the keys right. And it was shrinking everything else up to that position and not that. So, Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. It's always interested me as one of those little battles which has lots of consequences, because you have 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers on one side from the US. You have Arleigh Burke there in charge of the destroyers. You have Aaron S. Merrill there in charge of the cruisers and in sort of the whole force. You have Bernard Austin there as Burke's second. And these are some really skilled officers who go on to really high careers. Burke, of course, goes on to become the Chief of Naval Operations under Eisenhower and Kennedy. Merrill, well, he goes on to become a Vice Admiral and serves until 1947. And Austin, he ends up being President of the Naval War College after commanding the US Second Fleet. Held all sorts of other interesting posts. Frankly, is one of the most, I would argue, important persons in shaping how the modern US Navy thinks. So, you have these 3 people from the American side who are going to be incredibly important to how the US Navy develops post-war Second World War. And on the Japanese side, you have, well, 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers, plus some aircraft as well chucked in for the hell of it. And you have your commanders. Now, Sentaro Omori as a senior admiral. Then we have Baron Matsuji Injuin. And please note, yes, I am taking time before I say these names because I'm trying to say them correctly. Morikazu Osugi. All experienced officers, all capable officers. All officers with names which frankly I find scary to try and pronounce. But these were good officers in terms of their naval ability. Let's be honest, some of them do not have necessarily the best end. For example, with Morikazu Osugi, we have interesting discussions towards his end. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes during the Second World War, and he goes to do hard labour in Sugumi prison. He's then placed on a list of retired officers, and then his death is reported on 28th of August 1948. Now, the interesting thing about that is he's often stated as having been executed that day. But the American courts are only talking about life imprisonment. So what are the options? Was he executed? It's unlikely, because honestly, when the courts are not ordering an execution, the Americans in the military prisons didn't didn't tend to jump in. It wouldn't be a good look, especially when they were trying to do other things. However, a lot of senior Japanese officers did take the loss of the war and the aftermath of the war very badly. But still, that's all after the battle we're going to be talking about. That's all after the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. Shameless book plug, yay! And hopefully, soon, yes, there are people I need to talk to and everything now. Once I'm sort of in a better space to organise it, I will be able to talk to them and sort things out. But there will be more books to add up to here soon. They will be self-published, so they'll probably be released on Kindle alone. But who knows, maybe once I've got them up and people actually like them, maybe a publisher will look at them and go, yeah, we'll produce some physical copies of that because it's obviously popular. Probably won't hand over the Kindle version. I don't think I'll sign that over. I like the idea of keeping control of that myself, and that under my own auspices. So, what is the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay? Well, it's part of the Bougainville campaign portion of Operation Cartwheel, which is basically the US Navy's, and honestly the US Army's kind of forced to go along with it because they can't go anywhere without the US Navy taking them there. A roadmap for victory. It's the island hopping campaign in a way, but it's for the Southwest Pacific, where the island hopping isn't quite so much hopping as stepping. And they're working their way through the Solomon Islands, they're working their way through the various parts of the Southwest Pacific to regain territory, and most importantly, to push the Japanese back. And this battle is important because it's getting closer and closer to New Britain and Rabaul. And Rabaul is critical to Japanese infrastructure and logistics. Rabaul is the centre for their operations, far more than Singapore is in this region. There's a reason for that. One, it's easy to get to, but also there's the problem with Singapore is that there are British, Australian and American submarines all operating in that area. There are British submarines coming across the Indian Ocean, there are British submarines coming out from Australia, there are Dutch submarines operating from Australia, there are American submarines operating from multiple bases in Australia, and they are a constant presence. And to an extent, getting to Rabaul is actually easier than Singapore in terms of being able to maneuver over a wider area, and therefore more likely have your convoys avoid, if you're running a convoy, avoid submarines. It's the classic thing of where is the biggest shooting nest for the British if they ran their convoys through? It's the Channel. So that's why the British do not run convoys. Not large ones. And usually not any, if they can avoid it, through the Channel. Because that's literally you're sending your ships into a shooting gallery. And a single submarine or single thing can cause all sorts of problems. If we consider the Western approaches to doing this Channel convoy system, the HXA system, convoy sets, they don't run in the Channel from 1940 to 1944. In fact, most of the convoys you sort of see in World War II, which are listed as running through the Channel, are post-1944. Why? Because it narrows down so much. And again, when you're looking at Singapore, there's a lot of areas which narrow down approaching that. So they do still use Singapore, but Rabaul is far more important. And this means that The Japanese are far more committed to defense of a ball. They have to. And it's one of the few things which the Army and the Navy both agree on. And that's a shock. When the Army and the Navy actually agree. I'm not saying they coordinate, they just agree. Don't go too far, okay? Look, World War II is annoying from both the Army and the Navy's perspective of the Imperial Japanese forces because it gets in the way of them fighting their real enemy, each other. It's just terrible. How thoughtless are the Americans just not to finish, not to surrender, give in, and then they can get back to the important person to fight. So, that's basically the core aim of the strategy. And, well, the Somme Lines are a highway. They really are. They are a straight line highway. And they slowly work up this campaign. And as you can see, Bougainville is Operation Cherry Blossom. 1st of November 1943. So actually, the day I'm recording this. 80 years ago. And that's an important thing to think about, because you've already had Chronicle, Toenails. You've had Vela La Vela, which didn't get an operation name, it just happened. But basically you've had some troops from the US Infantry Division and the 3rd Division of the New Zealand Army land there. Then you've had Operation Postan, Operation Good Time, Blissful, and finally Cherry Blossom. Then there's going to be later on Dexterity, the various operations for Green Island, Admiralty Islands, and Emero Island. What you also realise very quickly once you look through this, it is truly an Allied operation. There are US Marines, there is the US Army, there are the Australians and the New Zealanders all taking their part. And yes, I do call this an Allied operation when there are US Marines and US Army operating together, because, again, honestly, war for those two organisations just means they cannot spend as much time winding the other up. You know, for the IJA and the IJN, it's about fighting each other. For the US Army and the US Marines, it's about constantly winding each other up. I mean, seriously. Some of the jokes, I've heard some of the ones, and that carry on. It's just non-stop, so war just gets in the way of that. I do understand. But no, this is slowly a campaign working its way up. So again, the Japanese kind of know what's coming. The Japanese can see this happening because you can follow these lines up and watch them as they're slowly spreading up. As such, the battle we're talking about, Empress Augusta Bay. There is no coincidence that it takes place on the 1st and 2nd, night of the 1st and 2nd November, when you have Operation Cherry Blossom taking place on the 1st November, when you have the 3rd Marine Division landing at Cape Torokina in Empress Augusta Bay. Because the Japanese are trying to resupply their forces on the island, but they're also trying to stop the amphibious landings. Kind of like what happened at Savo Island in August 1942. They are trying to attack and disrupt the Allied operations. And again, it's getting closer and closer to Rabaul. It's getting closer and closer to the heart of their territory in these islands. And it's all part of a plan orchestrated by, well, basically these individuals. I have pictures for some of them. Other ones I have... Well, how to put it? The South Pacific Island bases. Working out which commander is actually in charge of which forces at this point is an exercise in administrative mathematics and divination which is beyond my ken currently. to use the Scottish phraseology. There is a transition period going on, it seems to be at this point, and therefore one officer could be in command or another officer could be in command, but basically this is, broadly speaking, your command structure. You have the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Operations Area, Admiral Just the Nimitz. Then you have the Commander South Pacific, Halsey. Always nice to have him along, and let's be honest, William Halsey is, for all the good things and bad things of him, is a fairly decent commander. He does have some bad points. I'm not going to claim he's perfect. But he's also hard-working, committed, and he's going to drive his forces onwards. And sometimes that is what you need. Sometimes, as a senior commander, the only thing you can do is keep driving your forces onwards. That won't necessarily endear you to them, but it's what needs to be done. Because you can't stay still, you can't fall back, your only option is to go forwards. It's going to cost lives, but it's going to cost a lot less than falling back. So that's what you have to do. But the actual area we're sort of talking about, well, we're talking about the amphibious forces, we're talking which are under Admiral Richmond Turner, a really good admiral. We've got the naval forces under Gormley. Another officer goes on to some very interesting things. We have the army forces under Major General Millard Harmon. That's just a cool name, Millard Harmon. And we have the South Pacific Air Forces under Admiral John S. McCain Sr. There's also Aubrey Fitch wandering around, who I've put in this role here because he seems to wander around with McCain, and they're sometimes in different. They're both in charge of various aircraft formations, but which one seems to be doing which role occasionally is a bit of a transition again. But broadly speaking, at this point, this is what I think they are doing. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But I've gone through 4 books, and they seem to, 3 of them have them in this formation, at this time period. And helpfully, they just say, in the October-November campaign period, or for Operation Cartwheel, or that sort of thing. They don't always give an exact timeline of when they're talking about. And I always try to be honest in books and in videos when I'm not quite sure what the source, if the sources are telling me the correct thing. And also I have access to are telling me the correct thing. To me, it would make sense if there was a bit of a transition between the two, because this one is going to be keeping up with the forces as they move forward, and then the forces behind them are going to be falling under this one. But sometimes it's going to transition to those forces, because he might be moving and his headquarters might be moving, in which case you still need a headquarters to be running and sorting things out, and so the natural headquarters to assist and take over things will be this one. And the same when this headquarters is moving up to better keep contact with the various things going on, then this one's headquarters is going to take over. That would just seem to be the sensible thing. Plus, they seem to have got on quite well for senior US Navy admirals. I know I've already mentioned about the fact that war is a distraction for the US Marines and US Army from their favourite pastime of winding each other up. But when it comes to US Navy admirals, quite a lot of them seem to be their favourite time and seems to be playing golf against each other, which can turn into absolute bloodthirsty rivalries on the golf course. I mean, off it they are completely good, they're fairly good friends, but on the golf course they seem to be there was a Australian admiral who played with 2 US admirals, and someday I'm going to do a video about the social lives of various admirals in World War II, and so I'm not going to go into too many details, but he's playing golf with them, and he before they got on the golf course, they're good friends. He imagined them best friends for years. You know, they went to Annapolis together. They have this long relationship. On the golf course, there is so much smack talk, and there is so much venom in the points that he thinks they must be deadly enemies. And then they get to the end of the golf game, and they're back to bonhomie, and he's just going, I fit right in here. But no, this is your command structure, and again, this is something which the Americans are lucky. They have a lot of very good officers here. Turner is especially someone who, frankly, for amphibious warfare, is who you want around. You want Turner. If you can get him, he turns up in a lot of amphibious operations in World War II for that reason. He's very good at them. Millard, I have to admit, is the officer of this group who I'm least familiar with. And even I, when looking through his record, was going, wow, so the US Army had him, and they still had MacArthur doing what MacArthur was doing? Was there just no ability to get MacArthur to retire? Was that the problem? Was he even still in command? Was he just there and he ended up in command because he said he was in command and no one wanted to correct him? But a good officer. A very good officer. So the purpose of the battle is to protect this stuff. It's to protect the amphibious warfare operations, to protect the resupply. And from the Japanese perspective, of course, its purpose is to try and interdict the resupply. And that's why they have quite such a heavy force. That's why they have quite such a formation they have. If you consider a similar scenario, it's kind of like what the 10th Flotilla were doing to protect the beaches of D-Day. And the Battle of Ile-de-Basse. So, with that all out of the way, let's look at the forces involved. The US forces, well, they have a division of light cruisers, Cleveland class. They're directly commanded by Aaron S. Merrill, at Rear Admiral. Then they have Desron 23, Fletcher class destroyers. None of this sounds like a good thing to be fighting. I mean, Cleveland's... No, I can't imagine anyone willingly deciding that what they're going to do is attack Cleveland's. In this period, they have 12 6-inch guns, which are all, of course, 6 inches, very rapid firing, and considering their radar assisted as well in their aiming, and they're about the same size as the heavy cruisers because of the Japanese. That's not a good position to try and fight those things. They can, at the likely engagement range, they can hit you just as well as you can hit them, but the difference is they are more likely to hit you because they're firing salvos of lots of 6-inch guns, 12 shells a salvo, and they're going to be firing a far higher rate of fire than you're going to be achieving with 8-inch guns, and they're radar assisted, so they're going to know where they're hitting, or rather know where their target is, even in darkness. Which takes us back to this earlier picture. And it's a very cool picture, but that is the Columbia, view of USS Cleveland, as they're firing at the Japanese warships. So this is Columbia. That's not a good scenario for them. That's probably the worst. This is the thing, between Savo Island taking place and the Battle of Augusta Bay, there have been a lot of developments on the US side. And then, also radar equipped, you have the Destroyer Squadron 23, which is probably one of the most heavily worked up destroyer squadrons in the US Navy, and that is saying something at this time, because they're all working frigating hard. The one thing you can guarantee in both major powers of the Allied effort in World War II, the Royal Navy and the US Navy, their destroyer forces are worked up. They have been working them up for the last 20 years. In both forces, they are, to an extent, an elite. That's just the way they are. And they've got that way by, in many ways, encouraging aggression, but also encouraging professionalism. You have Desron 23, it's divided into two divisions. There's Division 45, which has the Charles Osborne, the Dyson, the Stanley and the Claxton. And there's Division 26, which is of course under the command of Bernard Austin, which is Spence, Thatcher, Converse and Foote. Now Merrill is the task force commander. And pretty much they are arranged in a sort of standard position. What am I saying by standard position? Well, you have the forces in Senat is in roughly 3 columns. They have 4 destroyers, 4 cruisers, roughly. When they are manoeuvring, that makes a very strong group for them, because it means that you can't really launch torpedoes at the cruisers without trying to get through the destroyers first. Especially at the ranges they're sailing at using radar to hold their positions. So it makes life more difficult for the Japanese. And these are US commanders. I already talked a bit about them, but I think I'll talk a bit more about them. Now let's consider these gentlemen. Well, you have Aaron S. Merrill in charge. And as said, he is a noted officer. He had been Professor of Naval Science and Tactics at Tulane University before World War II. After he'd served as commander of a destroyer division with the Sumners as his flagship. And in April 1942, he's given command of the USS Indiana, that's BB-58. He's promoted to Rear Admiral in January 1943, and then he's given a cruiser-destroyer force for the Battle of Guadalcanal, and of course, Bougainville campaign. Now, one of the things he's noted as is a radar expert. He actually, at one point, wins quite a lot of acclaim because he uses radar during the Battle of Blanket Strait, which is in March 1943. Prior to this, commanding Task Force 68 at the time, he destroyed 2 Japanese destroyers, Masami and Minengo, using only radar fire control. So we are often going to be talking about Admiral Ching Lee. We're going to be talking about him and his capabilities in terms of radar fire control. But the fact is, there's also Merrill. There are a few other officers out there who are pushing just as hard and using this system just as much. In Arleigh Burke's case, I have a picture of him up there, cropped from the photo of him when he was with Mark Mitcher. After they transfer from, transfer to the Enterprise after Bunker Hill was hit twice by kamikazes. He was, of course, known as 31 Knot Burke. And there are 2 potential stories for the origin of this title. The first is that whilst normally he pushed his destroyers to maximum speed to get anywhere, for rendezvous prior to the Battle of Cape St. George, the USS Spence, one of his ships, managed to have a boiler tube blocked by a brush, which had been used for cleaning, and that limited the squadron to 31 knots. So that would mean his original nickname of 31 knots, Burke, was originally a taunt. But Gene Edward Smith, in his biography of Eisenhower, well, gave a different view, and it's always interesting that this comes up in that sort of scenario, but again, considering all the efforts that Burke did with various political figures, they could well have heard the story, or made an effort to try and find out what was the reason behind the story. And but this scenario put Burke mistakenly leading his destroyer squadron into a minefield. Admiral Halsey radioed to ask what he was doing in the minefield. Burke replied 31 knots. Both options are quite potentially true, but I would say Burke is a man who learns from his mistakes. And again, he'd been in the Battle of Blanket Strait, and he'd actually hesitated to open the fire when his radar operator made first contact with the enemy. But that was when he comes up with possibly his most famous quote. He asks an ensign who's nearby after the battle, "What's the difference between a good officer and a poor one?" The ensign tries to come up with some sort of response, some sort of nice response, and Burke offers the point: the difference between a good officer and a poor one is about 10 seconds. It's rather an apt description for today's scenario, because basically it's whether you take the decision or you hesitate. The reason Burke had hesitated was because radar didn't allow him to confidently work out who he was firing at. He was worried it could be one of his own ships. He was worried it could be another ship which was out of formation. It wasn't. But he was worried about that, and so he hesitated. Bernard Austin. Good Lord. The man had, as I've said before, a very interesting career. But I think post-World War II was sort of concentrated on his career. In October 1945, he's ordered to duty in the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, D.C. In December 1945, he becomes Navy Secretary of the State War Navy Coordinating Committee. That's a very important role. He then becomes a member of the first class of the National War College at Fort Leslie in JFK, Washington. And in June 1947, he is sent as Special Assistant to the Assistant Chief of Naval Operations for Political Military Affairs, Department of Navy, serving until October 1949. During this time, he does a one-year special duty assignment at the Office of the Naval Attaché, London, while he was doing time serving at the British Imperial Defence College. He completed his studies there in 1949. He's in command of Service Squadron 1 in January 1950, but in July 1950, after the outbreak of the Korean War, he's sent to the Western Pacific and organises Service Squadron 3 to sort out logistic operations in support of the combat effort in Korea. He carries on doing all sorts of key staff duties, and in 1960 he becomes the 32nd President of the Naval War College. He receives a Gold Star for his term as college presidency, with a citation reading that Vice Admiral Austin drew upon his great wealth of wisdom and experience in a dedicated effort to enrich the postgraduate education of students at the Naval War College in the field of maritime strategy and its relationship to overall national and allied objectives and strategy. and went on to talk about all the duties he'd done that were highly beneficial to professional and diplomatic relations amongst the participants. He was also president of the Board of Inquiry for the loss of the USS Fresher, where he made some enemies, but the thing is, he is consistently called back to be presidents of boards of inquiry. He's trusted. So yeah, you really couldn't have 3 more interesting officers to be in charge of the American forces. You just couldn't. So, without much further ado, let's go to the Japanese side. That's fine. Well, you have the heavy cruiser Division 5, Myoko class cruisers under Sentaro Omori, Myoko and Haguro. Now, you have a slight difference here in that you have a full admiral rather than a rear admiral in charge, and this again reflects that the Japanese, to be honest, have a surfeit of senior officers versus their numbers of ships. You could almost say they were planning on an expansion and increasing their number, had the senior officers to befit the growing expansion, but there's also the fact that they have far more centralized command. They have far more of a system whereby you have to be more senior to make a decision. And so if you want a force to be more independent in its approach and action, you need to send out a consequently more senior officer who expects to be independent. It causes issues. But their scenario is slightly different. They've got less destroyers, but they do have 2 heavy cruisers. But what they do is they stick their light cruisers and 3 destroyers in each of the wings. So they put them sort of a right screen and a left screen, or port and starboard screens. And that is their formation. They have their heavy cruisers in the middle, and they have their light cruisers and destroyers out on the sides. It's not a stronger formation. Why? When you're talking about 4 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and each side, it's surely the same formation. Well, the reason it's not as strong is simple, really. The light cruisers involved are not exactly the best Japanese light cruisers available, but that really wouldn't affect it. What does affect it is the fact that if they're operating with the destroyers, then they're not operating as a unit. When you've got the 4 destroyers of Desron 23, the 8 destroyers, but the 2 divisions, Desron 45 and Des Division 45 and Des Division 46, they operate as one. They are 4 Fletchers. They have very similar operating characteristics because they're the same class. There are going to be variations depending on their construction, depending on wear and tear of their boilers and all sorts of things, but they're going to be, broadly speaking, the same. Or similar enough. So when they do something together, they're going to turn as one. They're going to organize as one. They're going to be able to... The moment you introduce ships which are a variation on that, especially in the tactics we're talking about in this period, you are introducing a level of complication. And especially once you stick a rear admiral in each of those divisions. Because the moment there's a rear admiral there is a change in the structure going on. We're talking about screens which are led by a commander on one side and a captain on the other side in the US Navy. There's a rear admiral on each screen. It's going to mean there's an admiral staff, there's a discussion, there's going to be the organisation. We're not talking about destroyer flotilla at this point, which is used to working together, destroyer squadron in the US case, of course, which is used to working together, which thinks as one, which practices one. We're talking about a formation which is going to be thinking through before they act. It means it's going to complicate things. It's going to require more thought process, more development before things get done. This is going to be a factor in operations. So, think about that. Here are our 3 senior officers. Now, Centauro Centauro Omori. There's a whole discussion over how his name should be put. I think it is Centauro Omori, and he commanded destroyers in the 1920s and 30s, and actually the battleship Ise in 1939-1940. He went to torpedo school, he went to various other development programs, but really developed himself into a torpedo technology and tactics expert. He was made Rear Admiral on the 15th of November 1940. He was actually in command of Destroyer Squadron 1, which attacked the strike force to Pearl Harbor. A destroyer squadron under command of a Rear Admiral. He also participated in the Indian Ocean Raid in 1942, and during the Battle of Midway, he directed the occupation of the Attu Island in the Battle of the Aleutian Islands. He was given command of Cruiser Division 5 and assigned to the Solomon Islands as a reward for this. After the battle, he's relieved of his command. This is for having withdrawn against what was supposed to be an inferior force. I'd argue it was not an inferior force. You've got 4 cruisers, you've got 8 destroyers on one side, you've got 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers on the other side. I would say you're at best talking about an even force. Once you consider the relative values of those American light cruisers versus his own and the radar advantages, I'd say you're talking about withdrawing in the face of a superior force to preserve your own forces. I'd say that was a sensible thing, but we'll get into that battle in a bit. After this, he becomes Commandant of the Torpedo School. He's promoted to Vice Admiral, although at this point he'd already been acting as Senior Admiral. So he's Admiral in charge. It's weird. He's not an Admiral, but he is an Admiral, and that's why I haven't put Rear Admiral or anything in front of him, because that's what he's doing. And he was Director of the Special Attack Division from September 1944 to August 1945, in charge of the Kaiten Human Guided Torpedoes programs. And then, after World War II, he's appointed Commander-in-Chief of the 7th Fleet. He dies in 1974. Baron Matsuji Ijuin. Well, he's an interesting officer. He managed to avoid combat during the early months of World War II. He'd previously, in the interwar period, had served as aide-de-camp to Fleet Admiral Prince Fushimi Hiroyoso, which was a very, very good post to get promoted up. Because let's be honest, Hiroyoso was one of the most powerful, especially politically, Japanese naval officers of the period, and was Chief of Staff of the IJN from 1932 to 1941. So, serving as his aide-de-camp in the 1930s, that's going to get you up. He'd seen no combat before he's promoted to Rear Admiral on the 1st of November 1943. He's given command of Desron 3, based at Rabaul, New Britain, and he takes part in the Battle of Honao and the Battle of Naval, and of course he is there for the Battle of Augusta Bay. He is in doing various operations. He's aboard the Sendai during the Battle of Augusta Bay, and he survives the sinking of the Sendai, is rescued, and is later killed when his flagship was torpedoed and sunk in May 1944 north of Saipan. The flagship at this point was the patrol boat Ikki. And yeah, we've been into Morikazu Osugi a little bit. You know, I've talked about his career in terms of its end. He'd had an interesting life. He was a dedicated Japanese officer who'd had several bureaucratic positions, I would have to admit, really, before he got command of in 1939 of the Maya, the heavy cruiser at the time. He did a lot of work with naval marksmanship, and in 1941 he was transferred to command the Congo after it had just been modernised. And that was in April 1941. He's then assigned to the Tsingtao Special Garrison Force, and at the same time becoming Chief of Staff of the 3rd Fleet, which was doing a lot of operations of China. He is often used for various of these roles, and that's one of the reasons why he ends up how do I put this politely? He ends up managing to do such things that he ends up on trial. There are lots of Japanese naval officers who manage to escape being tried because they don't commit actions which justify them being tried for war crimes. He does a lot of things. I don't want to get into it much here, but yeah. I'm trying to skirt around this stuff because one of the things you have to admit is one of the reasons why Omori is, this gentleman, goes through the trouble he does afterwards is because of this one making complaints and trying to suggest that the force was actually weaker than it was that they're facing. You know, he basically throws himself at maximum speed with his formation at the US cruisers. And he doesn't actually notice what his own flagships and command ships are doing. And that causes all sorts of issues. And basically you could argue that his aggression and his recklessness are what cause the losses. But he just, in the Japanese mold at this time, which appeals to a lot of their command structure, aggression is valued. It's the point at which you start to look at destroyer officers, because in the Royal Navy and the US Navy, destroyer officers' aggression is valued. But then the weeding out point becomes, do you have focus of your aggression? Are you able to control and temper that aggression and use it to fuel your actions, rather than to drive and control your actions? And Osugi, the more I've read about him, the more I think he didn't have the ability to temper it. He could talk a good game, he had the aggression, but when it came to actual combat, he couldn't temper that aggression. He couldn't turn that fire into steel. Which is rather sad, but it happens. So, I'm going to apologise quickly because this video might seem a little bit bitty because it keeps being recorded in sections because I've got weird things going on around me and I have to go deal with them. So I think this is about, like, possibly section 5 of what's going to end up in there. One of the versions of section 5. Anyway, so, how did the battle come to be? How did the battle come to be? Well, The Japanese forces are dispatched to go and find the Americans and hopefully intercept them and prevent them, because they've landed in areas where the Japanese army wasn't strong. Can't think why you'd land in an area where the Japanese army wasn't dug in, and that meant the best way to deal with this incursion, to deal with these forces, was to go and, with ships and aircraft, smash them. There is a small problem, because as the Japanese ships are actually cruising, I'd say it's roughly southeast towards Torrecanina, Cape Torrecanina. I want to give it a sort of a rough direction, but it's an angle. Okay. And the Americans were already withdrawing their landing craft and troop transports and assembling them to the southwest of Augusta Bay. The transports were ordered to depart at 1800 hours. 4 cargo vessels, which were only partially unloaded, remained, but the transports were moving. They'd offloaded their troops, they were going. The mine layers operating off Cape Mulk were also withdrawn. Since they're getting them out of their way, they know the Japanese are going to respond, and they're already acting as if they're already knowing they're coming there. And so, you're withdrawing these forces, you're withdrawing anything that you don't have to have in the zone. It's been a practice on amphibious operations for a long, long time. Anything you don't have to have in a position where you're fixed, you don't keep in a position where you're fixed. It's the whole advantage of aircraft carriers, the whole advantage of any sort of naval force, is being able to maneuver. And amphibious operation is the antithesis of this, because the moment you're offloading ships, you can't maneuver them, because you're offloading them. People do sometimes talk about it. Oh yes, we can use LCACs and all these things to offload them from the sea, and yeah, we can keep moving them. Yeah, that isn't that efficient. And it adds hours onto your journey, and they're moving around. They're still not able to move around in much space. It's actually oftentimes easier to bring them closer, stop them, and you can offload them more efficiently and get them out of the area more quickly. That's your problem. If you've got them maneuvering at sea and you're using some modern ship-to-shore systems to use them to do the maneuver from the sea, that will take more time. That will add more complexity. That will add more risk. And that can end up putting you at risk of enemy action, even more enemy action than if you go in close, which means the enemy will know where you are, but you can get it done a lot quicker. So it means the magnitude of response they can deliver is going to be more limited. For example, a scratch force of cruisers and destroyers. Unfortunately, for the Japanese, US reconnaissance aircraft detected them pretty much immediately. And so the American task force, which had up until that point been shelling some Japanese positions, standard amphibious operations support around sort of Buka in northern Bougainville, began sailing hard around Vela Vela. I keep getting that wrong. Vela. Sounds like it should be. It does sound like it should be a song, doesn't it? Vela. Sorry. I'm having a very random week, and I'm being even more random than I normally am. To intercept. They departed roughly midnight on the 1st, 2nd November to do that. So think about that. The amphibious transports had already gone 6 hours. Roughly. Already been sailing away for 6 hours before the American ships are launched to respond to the Japanese ships they detected. So again, that's another reason you come in close. You can deliver the troops as quickly and sufficiently as you can, and then you can get the frigate out of there. They managed to get themselves in position to block the entrance to Empress Augusta Bay. The Japanese come in from the northwest. So I said roughly southwest. So, if they come from northwest, southeast? Yeah, southeast. I said southwest earlier, didn't I? Oh, sorry, wrong. Wrong. I trying to get it right, I got it wrong. Aiming to attack and bombard the invasion force and destroy their transports. They thought they would still be there. They weren't. Even even 2 of the 4 cargo vessels were pretty much unloaded by this point, and the other 2 were mostly there, were heading there. At 01:30 hours, on 2nd November, the battle starts, when Haguru is struck amidships by an American aerial attack. Yes. First thing that hits them is not the ships, it's the aircraft. And it's one of the heavy cruisers. This is starting of the battle. This also attack means that the Japanese force now no longer has its ability to use its maximum speed, unless they want to abandon the Haguru. They actually reach radar contact with the American task force at 02:27 hours on the 2nd of November. And that's why I did the live. I think it's scheduled for the 2nd of November. Because that's when it really happens. Merrill, who's used to commanding forces by this point in night fights and using radar, and Burke, who has got past his previous issues with worrying, sends Burke's destroyers to attack the Japanese at the northern flank, has the cruisers turn about to remain outside of torpedo range. Appears to be some American officers have realised that the long lance is a thing, and asks Austin's group to launch a torpedo attack on the southern flank. Now, there is always an interesting line, because there's various reports that go through here of people saying, well, Burke sends destroyers. He's directly in command of Destroyer Division 45. Wherever it goes, he goes. He's commanded that. The way a squadron or a flotilla works is it's often divided up into divisions. It's got 8 vessels, it's divided up to 2 divisions of 4. Each have a divisional leader. Flotilla leader is often the divisional leader of the senior division as well. And usually what you find is there are probably 2 to 3 commanders spread around the squadron. One of them will be the divisional commander of the other division, and the rest of the vessels will be under command of lieutenant commanders. Sometimes you don't even have that many commanders. They're all lieutenant commanders other than one. Sometimes you even have a lieutenant commander as the divisional commander at points in World War II. But as a rule, usually that's roughly what we're talking about. Now, it's at this point that they start to really maneuver around each other. And at 02:46 hours, roughly 02:45 hours, they fire Burke's division, that's Destroyer Division 45, fire a salvo at the Japanese. The Sendai-led division managed to fire 8 torpedoes back at them, and each side attacks the attacks, and they both maneuver and avoid them. But the Japanese fleet becomes separated in the confusion. They divide into roughly 3 different formations. After this, Merrill sends in Destroyer Division 46. Unfortunately, the instructions sent to them are misinterpreted by Foote, which goes off in the wrong direction, and despite trying to rejoin the fight, for fear of colliding with Allied ships, they are effectively out of the battle from that point onwards. At roughly 02:50 hours, when they've realised that the torpedo attack had failed, the American cruisers open fire. They quickly disable Sendai, and her rudders jammed. At this point, the Japanese are in real trouble because Samadea collides with Shatsu, and they are forced to retire from the battle. Samadea receiving 5-inch hits at roughly 0300 hours. Miyoko collided with Hatsukeze, slicing off her bows, and also receiving significant damage. And Haraguru is hit by several of the 6-inch shells. Unfortunately, only a few of those detonate. The Japanese were relying on visual tracking of their targets. They managed to pinpoint the American cruisers and open fire at roughly 0313 hours. And at 0320 hours, fired several torpedoes at Cruiser Division 12. At 0327 hours, mostly confused by the firing of the Cleveland-class's own guns, Omori is reported to that several of the torpedoes had hit when actually they'd all missed their targets. At this point, the Americans are, you probably think are going, well, they're doing well. Well, they're also having fun. It's the joy of a night fight. Spence and Thatcher collided, but managed to continue the battle. Foote was hit by a torpedo that blew off the stern of it, which unfortunately left 19 dead and 17 wounded. And Foote therefore became a navigational hazard to other ships, adding to the joy of the battle. Confusion is often the words used, but honestly, it's let's just be honest. The battle, night battles are a mess, especially once you get into this sort of sudden range. And at a certain point, even radar tracking doesn't really help because you're so intermixed. Is that one of your ships? Is that one of the enemy ships? Foote is especially a good example of that. The Japanese don't have fire control radar, so they're using flares to illuminate their targets. And Cruiser Division 12 is constantly maneuvering to avoid star shells. But eventually, they are actually illuminated by Japanese snooper aircraft. Not really snooper aircraft. They were trying to wander around. They were reconnaissance aircraft trying to spot the enemy and illuminate them, and that's what they did. You could call it a snooper, but it's just another reconnaissance aircraft. Between 0320 and 0325 hours, Denver managed to get 3 8-inch hits, all of which failed to detonate. The amount of weapons which fail to go off and fail to hit in this battle, it really is a good example of what the reality of conflict was like. And whilst closing a group of Japanese destroyers in the centre, Spence was hit at the waterline by a shell that failed to explode. At this point, Japanese fire is starting sort of... This is at roughly 0330 hours, 0340 hours. It's starting to get increasingly accurate. So, the American cruisers... Well, the destroyers throw up a bit of a smoke screen, and the American cruisers manoeuvre behind it, which, of course, interferes with the Japanese gunnery, which is visual gunnery. And you think smoke causes trouble in the daytime? It causes a lot more trouble at night. Because it can make you think all sorts of things. If you can even peer through it, it can give you the idea that something is further away than it is at night. So it can throw off your ranging even if you can see the target. So even if you can see them firing their guns and go, yes, but it's through a smoke, and you're sort of going, I can't quite, looks dimmer, so they must be further away. It's really not helpful when you've got visual targeting systems. At several points, even though they were equipped with radar and a variation on an identification friend or foe system, early versions of those, the destroyers almost hit each other, and Destroyer Division 46 missed taking an opportunity to torpedo the center group of Japanese ships because they weren't certain of which ships they were. So that's a really good thing to think about, because Burke's earlier point was 10 seconds. Well, if you made the wrong decision and you sank an Allied ship, you'd be in real trouble. Either officially or unofficially. At 03:37 hours, so if you consider roughly the same time their fire was actually getting heavy, but just before the smoke came down, Omori believes that he has sunk a heavy cruiser. He's been fighting 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers. No heavy cruiser anywhere there. And is worried about being caught in daylight by US carrier aircraft. Ordered a retreat. Withdrawal. Merrill decides to chase after them, engaging Hatsukaze at 17,500 yards. They're unable to score any hits, but, well, the destroyers are also keeping up. Around 0400 hours, they have roughly, the remaining elements of destroyer divisions 45 and 46 have combined together roughly into Destroyer Squadron 23, and are basically engaging the Japanese stragglers, sinking the Sendai, driving off the remaining Northern Group ships. 04:13 hours, Spence loses speed because of water in the fuel line, fills out of formation, and the Americans are reporting many hits on their enemy contacts, but there are also issues in that Destroyer Division 45 actually fire on Spence at one point in error, although it caused no damage. Cruiser Division 12 catches up, and along with Spence, which is not going on as fast as the other destroyers, engage the Japanese straggler at 05:10 hours. But the cruisers were unable to distinguish between the straggler and Spence, so they ceased fire. At 05:19 hours, nearly more close to 05:20 hours probably actually, Desdiv 45 actually came to the aid of Spence, which had exhausted its ammunition by this point. Turned out at this point that they realised that the Japanese straggler was the Hatsukaze, the very, very damaged Hatsukaze, Kangero class destroyer. It was sunk. At daylight, pursuit's broken off. All ships low on fuel and ammunition ordered to rendezvous with Foot because Merrill wanted to gather the ships together and get them all home safely. And it's at this point that a heavy Japanese air attack of roughly 100 aircraft was launched from Rabaul early in the morning. Directs the US ships and starts to attack them, but with the assistance of US and New Zealand aircraft, which are based ashore, they drive them off, and heavy air losses are inflicted on the Japanese aircraft. They managed to hit Montpellier, but 9 wounded, and Foot was able to be towed to Tulagi for repairs. Now, I mentioned Osugi earlier, and I said he caused some issues in this. Well, the point is Hatsukaze, because his aggressiveness meant that he's in charge of the right, and he charges at the enemy, but doesn't pay any attention to what his commander's doing. And he doesn't notice the flagship sort of takes a different move. It heads off towards the east and then returns back to the west, sort of traversed to his own route. And anyways, and 0300 hours, Miyoko rams Hatsukaze because of this, because they run straight in front of it and they didn't see. And Wakatsuki has to perform a almost impossible maneuver to avoid Hagoro. And it's at this point that Osugi has to cancel a torpedo attack because the Haguru is between the two unharmed destroyers and the US line. He's been going to attack his own the heavy cruisers. And Hatsukaze, which is left without a bow, he abandons the idea of towing it away from the fight. He follows Miyoko and Haguru, which were heading south at this point, to move away from the US ships. So what were the results of all this? What were the results of all this command? Well, the Sendai was lost. The Americans had a cruiser damaged and 2 destroyer damaged, 19 killed. The Japanese lost a light cruiser sunk, a destroyer sunk, heavy cruiser damaged, light cruiser damaged, 2 destroyers heavily damaged, 25 aircraft shot down, as many as 660 possibly killed. There are some people which put it roughly 200, some sources put it up to 660. It was a large bill for not much of a result. And ultimately they arrived too late because those amphibious forces had achieved their operation. And whilst, yes, the ships, if they'd been unopposed, could have bombarded the amphibious forces ashore, the supplies were not easy to spot from the sea, and definitely not easy to spot at night. They'd been hidden. They had moved their supplies in as far in as they could get them. So it's not a good result. In summary, I honestly sometimes don't know really what to say about this battle, because whilst it's a good battle to illustrate things, and it's interesting to look at and talk about the command structures and the personalities involved, and you do have the scenario that the Americans managed to keep, by being just that little more tempered in their aggression, managed to keep full core control. But honestly, the Americans are putting in a far, far more capable force, far more standardized force. The Japanese, by this point, are already throwing together mixed forces, whatever they can get their hands on, because their infrastructure has been worn down that much. They never had much in the beginning, and their fleet numbers have been worn down because they can't replace what's being lost. So they're in trouble. They are in trouble. And if you consider the American fleet involved, Cleveland's, Fletcher's, these are mostly pretty much new ships. They are overwhelming the Japanese with volume of numbers and standardization. And that means they can work together better. If you're doing a night attack and you have got things which are forces which have been thrown together, you're going to add to the confusion. Whereas if you've got forces which have worked together for a long time and have practiced together, they're going to know what they're doing. It doesn't matter whether the cruiser squadron has worked with the destroyer squadron. That doesn't matter so much. They know their duties in that role. What matters is, especially the destroyers know each other and can work well together and have trust and faith in each other. Especially as they're going to be doing a lot of the closer work. Because that's the other thing. If you're trying to use light cruisers for the closer work, you're going to be running into trouble. Whereas what the Americans do is they keep their cruisers back, providing a base of fire, and the destroyers are running in, going into the melee, withdrawing to repair, sort themselves, and running back in again. It's a constant process. And it works. The cruisers support the destroyers support the cruisers. So what have we got coming? Well, we have unrotated projectiles, anti-hypersonic missiles. That's going to be fun. We also have 21st century sea power. I'm looking forward to that. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And the question today. We talk about radar in its case in World War II in similar terminology as we talk about stealth today. In World War II, the ability to see things gave you power to hit what you needed to do. In today's terminology, the ability to avoid being seen gives you the power to hit. There is a cycle to this. There is a cycle to this. If you consider the ships in the sort of the age of, not sort of the Victorian Navy sort of period, the late 19th century, one of the reasons they have the low freeboards they do is to try and make them as low a profile as possible, so that they can't be seen at longer ranges, to try and allow them to get close with be a surprise, as if the smoke plumes coming out from their engines didn't necessarily reveal that one. Steam doesn't always, smoke and steam doesn't always come out of engines. It's not always thick black stuff. You can get decent coal, and you can keep your engines clean, but it's very difficult to actually stop that revealing a position within certain ranges. So it's a part of a constant battle. And the question I'd like to ask, really, I need a better picture for a question, don't I? Now, this one, although, because this one really illustrates this battle. With the knowledge that therefore these things change, and that also this technology, whilst its radar especially is a good example, has come into service and officers are developing themselves to deal with the new systems, do you think Arleigh Burke was correct in that earlier quote of saying the difference between a good officer and a poor officer is 10 seconds? Is he holding himself to an impossible standard? Is he holding others to an impossible standard, expecting himself to instantly assume and take on all the knowledge which he now needs to operate because of the way radar and things have changed? When he spent his lifetime being trained to have visual identification and the confirmation of a target before firing his weapons, is he holding himself to an impossible standard to overcome that training? I'd say that's an important point to think about and discuss with a view to the past and a view to the future with modern weapons and modern systems being developed. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Take care.